You can feel it, can't you?
Yeah.
The political air right now just feels thick with anxiety. We all see the gridlock, the ever-increasing polarization.
And that creeping sense that our governments are just fundamentally incapable of solving the big problems.
Exactly. Climate change, economic stability, you name it.
Yeah.
And most of the time, the conversation is about which politicians are failing us or, which policies are wrong.
But what if the problem isn't the people at all? Or even the specific policies? What if the problem is the very machine we use to choose our leaders in the first place?
Okay, so that's a much bigger question.
It is, and it's the core diagnosis in the source we're deep diving into today, which is the answer. How sortition can rebuild our broken politics. The author, Kizzi Nkwocha, makes this really bold claim.
Which is?
That all the political dysfunction we see, the corruption, the gridlock, it's not a temporary bug that we can just patch up with some reform. He argues it's an inevitable systemic feature of competitive electoral democracy itself.
Wow, okay, so let's unpack that diagnosis.
Right.
Kizzi Nkwocha, the author, he's not just an academic theorist. He's a widely respected media consultant, a journalist, a publisher.
Right. He's been at places like News International. He publishes Business Game Changer magazine. He really understands the engine room of modern politics and communication.
And crucially, there's a personal angle here. Nkwocha is a refugee of the Nigeria-Biafra War. So his interest in this isn't just abstract. It's grounded in a real, visceral understanding of what happens when governance fails.
Precisely. And because that diagnosis is so stark, his proposed solution in the answer is just as radical. He says if elections are structurally designed to fail, then the only logical answer is a structural replacement.
So what's the replacement?
To move past the ballot box entirely and adopt something called sortition, basically government by random selection.
All right. This is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
It is. We're going to explore why, according to the answer, the current system is almost mathematically designed to produce political failure, and then look at the evidence that this ancient random mechanism might actually be the most democratic and resilient way forward.
Okay, so if we're running with the premise of the answer, that our political problems are features, not bugs, then we have to look at the machinery. What are the structural incentives that are pushing officials away from the middle, away from compromise?
Well, Kizzi Nkwocha really zeroes in on three powerful forces that all push in the same direction. The first one is the gauntlet of party nominations.
The primaries.
The primaries. Before a candidate can even face the general public, they have to win a primary election. And the data is really clear on this. Primary voters are not representative of the general electorate.
They're more ideological, right, more committed.
Much more. They tend to be older, more partisan, more ideologically pure. So the very first filter a candidate has to pass through is one that rewards ideological purity and unwavering party loyalty.
So if you even hint at compromise, or say something nice about the other side during a primary,
you're toast. You risk being labeled a traitor or disloyal by a more extreme rival from within your own party. This system is literally engineered from day one to punish the very act of moderation that you need to govern effectively.
and that's just the first hurdle.
Exactly. And that ideological hardening gets immediately reinforced by the second dynamic, fundraising.
Money. It always comes down to the money.
Always. Modern elections are astronomically expensive. You need a constant, massive flow of cash for staff, for ads, for polling. And where does that money come from?
Well, you have the big donors, but a lot of it now is from the small dollar base, right?
Right. And what motivates thousands of people to click that Donate Now button on an email? It's almost never a calm, nuanced 5-point plan on infrastructure policy.
No, it's outrage. It's fear. It's the other side is going to destroy the country.
Precisely. Small donors respond most reliably to messages of existential threat. So, as a politician, your financial lifeblood, the very architecture that keeps your campaign alive, is directly tied to making the other side seem monstrous.
So nuance is punished financially.
It's a liability. If you say, my opponents are reasonable people with a different approach, your fundraising dries up. If you say, they are a fundamental threat to our way of life, the money pours in. The answer is brutal on this point. The system financially incentivizes inflammatory rhetoric.
And then there's the third piece of the puzzle, which Kizzi Nkwocha knows inside and out as a media guy. Media coverage.
Look, conflict is exciting. Compromise is boring. It's that simple. And with the 24/7 news cycle and the demands of social media, This has gone into overdrive.
A politician who spends 6 months quietly negotiating a bipartisan farm bill gets zero airtime.
Zero. They're not providing content. But the representative who goes on cable news and delivers a blistering takedown of the opposition or posts something that goes viral with outrage, they get all the visibility.
And that visibility helps them with fundraising, and it shores up their support with that primary base we talked about.
It's a perfect vicious circle. Primary purity, financial outrage, and media conflict all feed each other. It's a positive feedback loop that just relentlessly drives polarization and makes the whole system more and more fragile.
So all of this,
Yeah.
this hyperpolarization, it's not just making politics unpleasant to watch.
Yeah.
It has a real structural consequence.
It leads directly to catastrophic gridlock.
Because all that anger and division crashes right into the machinery of government.
Right. Nearly every democratic system has what we call veto points. Things like 2 houses of a legislature, Senate filibusters, committee structures, judicial review. They were designed, to slow things down and force deliberation.
But the answer argues they've become weapons now.
They've been transformed from safety mechanisms into obstruction mechanisms. When you view the other party not as a competitor but as an existential enemy, your primary incentive is no longer to pass your own agenda.
It's to make sure they fail.
It's to block everything they do. Because, electorally, if the other side has a big success, that helps them get reelected. So the political logic, the survival logic, is to ensure the government fails spectacularly. And the result is a system that can't solve urgent problems even when the public is screaming for action.
But the gridlock isn't just about partisan fighting, is it? The answer points to something deeper, a kind of dysfunction within the administrative state itself. It calls it bureaucratic sclerosis.
That's right. And you have to appreciate the sheer scale of modern government to get this. Think about a really complex policy, like, say, trying to decarbonize the entire energy grid.
Okay, that's a huge task.
It's massive, and it requires dozens of different independent bureaucracies to all work together. You need the Department of Energy, sure, but you also need the Department of Transportation, environmental regulators, financial agencies, even local city zoning boards.
And they all have their own turf, their own way of doing things.
Exactly. Each of those agencies has spent decades optimizing itself for its own core mission. They have their own cultures, their own stakeholders, their own procedures, and they protect their boundaries fiercely.
So what happens when a big cross-cutting directive comes down?
They resist. A Department of Transportation that's built to maximize the flow of cars and trucks might fight a climate mandate that wants to prioritize rail because that new goal disrupts its entire institutional logic. So you get this systemic inertia, this sclerosis, where holistic policy is just impossible to implement.
And that inertia gets even worse because of something the book calls the expertise paradox.
Yes. We all agree that modern problems, a pandemic, AI regulation, financial crises, they require deep technical understanding. You need the experts. And those experts operate on what you could call technical rationality.
They're looking for the most efficient, evidence-based solution.
Right. Costs, benefits, data. But our elected officials operate on a completely different logic.
Yeah.
Political rationality.
Which is, what will my voters think? What will my donors think? Will this help me win the next election?
Exactly. And those two logics are often just fundamentally incompatible.
Can you give us an example of where they collide?
A carbon tax is the classic one. From a technical economic perspective, many experts would agree that a simple revenue-neutral carbon tax is the most efficient way to reduce emissions. That's the technical answer.
Politically.
It's electoral poison in many places. The word tax is a killer, so a politician is faced with a choice. Support the technically optimal solution and risk losing their job, or reject the expert consensus to ensure their own political survival.
And in an electoral system, survival always wins.
Every single time. And the polarization we talked about just pours gasoline on this fire. As Kizzi Nkwocha points out in the answer, expertise itself becomes just another partisan football.
So if one party owns climate science, the other party's job is to find their own experts to say it's all a hoax.
Precisely. It gives politicians permission to just ignore the expert consensus because their base doesn't believe in that consensus anyway. And what you're left with is a paralyzed system just swinging between technical policies that nobody votes for and populist policies that don't actually work.
This analysis leads to one of the most provocative conclusions in the answer, which is that Trying to reform the system is basically an illusion.
That's the core of it. Reformers fail because they're treating these deep structural flaws as if they were just minor bugs in the software. They think if we just tweak the rules a bit, electoral democracy will finally work as intended.
And Kizzi Nkwocha argues it never will. He spends a lot of time on why common reforms are doomed to fail. Let's talk about the big one, campaign finance reform.
Right. People are always proposing new rules. Let's cap donations. Let's force more transparency. Let's have public financing. And these efforts never, ever get to the root of the problem.
Why not? I mean, if you stop a billionaire from giving $1 million directly to a candidate, that has to reduce their influence, doesn't it?
You'd think so, but the answer explains that the problem isn't the source of the money. It's the competitive need for the money. As long as you have competitive elections, you will have a desperate, ever-increasing need for vast resources to win.
And money finds a way.
It operates like water. This is what's called the hydraulic theory of campaign finance. If you block one channel, say, by banning direct corporate donations, the money doesn't just disappear, it finds a new path.
It flows into super PACs or dark money groups or so-called issue advocacy nonprofits.
Exactly. The vehicle changes, but the dependency remains. The only way to actually eliminate the corrupting influence of donor dependency is to eliminate the need for donors, and that means getting rid of the competitive election itself.
Okay, what about another popular idea? Term limits. The goal there is to stop politicians from becoming entrenched careerists.
It's a noble goal, but the answer argues it doesn't change the fundamental incentives a politician faces while they're actually in office. They still need their party support. They still need to raise money for the party. They still operate within that same toxic system.
Right. And worse, term limits can actually backfire. They can deepen the problem of capture.
How does that work?
Think about it. If you force representatives out after just a few years, they never develop deep institutional knowledge or policy expertise. So who do they become dependent on for information and guidance?
The permanent class. The lobbyists, the long-term staffers, the agency bureaucrats who've been there for decades.
Precisely. Term limits effectively shift power away from the temporary elected official and toward the permanent, unelected administrative and lobbying class. It just moves the locus of power. It doesn't fix the underlying problem.
So the end result of all this, the polarization, the gridlock, the feeling that reform is impossible, is really dangerous. It creates the perfect breeding ground for authoritarianism. This is the ultimate warning in the answer. When governments consistently fail to solve critical problems, public trust just collapses. And when that happens, people become frighteningly willing to trade their freedom for a simple promise of order and action.
Kizzi Nkwocha provides a lot of data on this, right?
Yeah.
Looking at how democracies are backsliding.
And does, using metrics like the Corruption Perception Index and the Democracy Index to show a clear pattern. The vulnerability is always the same. A democratic government fails to handle a major crisis.
Let's walk through some of the examples. What about economic failure? The book uses Venezuela.
Venezuela is a heartbreaking textbook case. Under an initially democratic system, you had decades of severe economic mismanagement under Chavez and then Maduro. Crippling price controls, massive public debt. It was a disaster.
And the numbers are just staggering.
By 2016, inflation was at 800%. Think about that. By 2017, it was estimated that nearly 3/4 of the population had lost, on average, 8 kilograms in body weight because of food shortages.
That kind of visible daily suffering creates desperation.
It creates an opening. That desperation is what Chavez leveraged to consolidate his power-ending term limits, packing the Supreme Court, crushing the opposition. Democracy failed to deliver the most basic good economic stability, and the people became receptive to a strongman who promised to take control.
Then you have a different model of backsliding, a more subtle one, in Europe with Hungary.
Right, which has been downgraded to an electoral autocracy. This is so important because it shows you don't need a military coup. You can dismantle a democracy from the inside using democratic tools.
What analysts call constitutional hardball.
Exactly. After the Fidesz party won a supermajority, they used their legitimate legislative power to rewrite the Constitution and pass a flood of laws designed to systematically eliminate any checks on their power.
So they went after the independent institutions.
They went after everything. They packed the Constitutional Court, they took over public media, they put loyalists in charge of every key agency. And this power grab led directly to massive systemic corruption. So bad that Hungary actually lost over €1 billion in EU funding because its rule of law was so broken.
And then there's the most primal trade-off of all, security for freedom. The book uses El Salvador as the prime example.
For years, life in El Salvador was a nightmare because of horrific gang violence. MS-13, Barrio 18. The state was failing to provide basic safety, so when Nayib Bukele came to power, he declared a state of emergency.
And suspended constitutional rights.
He suspended basic rights and launched a campaign of mass arrests. We're talking nearly 72,000 people jailed, many without any due process. And yet, his public approval ratings are through the roof.
Because he delivered security.
He delivered. The homicide rate plummeted. And this is the willing trade-off that Nkwocha identifies. For many Salvadorans, the immediate, tangible gain in personal safety is worth more than the abstract loss of democratic rights. They will accept a dictator if it means their kids can play outside safely.
So the thread connecting all these cases is clear.
It's democratic failure. The system failed to deliver a fundamental public good, be it economic stability, rule of law, or physical safety. And that created an opening for someone who promised to get things done no matter the cost.
The moment you start talking about replacing elections, you hit this huge conceptual wall, because for most of us, elections are democracy. That's the definition.
It's so deeply ingrained in our thinking, but the answer really forces you to challenge that. It reminds us that democracy at its core is just popular sovereignty government by the people. Elections are just one possible method for achieving that.
And a flawed one, as the book argues.
A deeply flawed one. And we need to kind of reset our historical perspective here. We forget that in the birthplace of democracy, ancient Athens, they viewed elections as being inherently aristocratic.
Wait, say that again. They thought elections were aristocratic?
Yes. For them, election selection by voting favored the aristos, the best. The wealthy, the well-connected, the people who are great public speakers, the people with the time and money to actually run a campaign.
That's a complete inversion of how we think about it today.
It is. For the Athenians, the most purely democratic tool was randomness, sortition, using a lottery. Because that was the only way to give every single eligible citizen an equal chance to serve. It neutralized all the built-in advantages of wealth and charisma.
They actually had a machine for it.
They did, the famous clariterion. It was a randomization device they used to select most of their public officials. And it ensured that their government was a real cross-section of the citizenry, not just a permanent, self-selecting political class.
So if it was so democratic, why did we end up with elections?
Well, partly it was about scale. The new nation-states were huge. But it was also partly because the founders of modern republics wanted a filter. They wanted to ensure that the best people, which to them meant the wealthy and educated, retained a level of control.
And the argument in the answer is that this filter is now completely broken.
It's broken. The forces of modern money, media, and partisanship have shattered the original promise of elections, forcing us to look back at that older and maybe more genuinely equitable form of democracy.
Okay, so let's be very clear. What does sortition actually mean today in a modern, complex country?
In its modern form, sortition means choosing decision makers by drawing lots from a carefully stratified pool of citizens. It's a process that completely bypasses competition, charisma, and money.
It's a fundamental shift from ambition to duty.
Exactly. You're replacing the professional political performer with the temporary citizen steward. And the power of that randomness is statistically undeniable. It's the most reliable way to create a group that is a true demographic mirror of society.
You get the people that elections always filter out.
You do. The introverts. The caregivers who can't take a year off to campaign. The factory worker, the farmer. Random selection forces their voices into the room.
But the big objection is always expertise. Is this just government by the ignorant?
No. And Kizzi Nkwocha is very clear on this. It is not anti-expertise. It's an integrator of expertise. The Citizen Assembly is given extensive, balanced briefings from the best technical experts, scientists, and policy analysts.
So it blends the technical knowledge with lived experience.
It blends the technical data with the how and the why it will affect real people's lives. It grounds policy in reality and prevents the kind of out-of-touch decisions that an insulated political class so often makes.
So the answer argues this isn't just a random gimmick. It's a fully structured system built on a few core principles that make it resilient. What are they?
Right. Kizzi Nkwocha lays out 4 guiding principles. The absolute foundation, the non-negotiable part, is equality.
And what does that mean in practice?
It means every single eligible citizen has an equal mathematical chance of being chosen to serve. That one structural fact completely short-circuits the biases of money and social status that dominate elections. If you can't buy your way in or campaign your way in, the system is structurally fair from the start.
It makes the system immune to financial capture.
Completely. The second principle then addresses careerism, and that's rotation.
So no one gets to stay in power forever.
No one. Service has to be temporary for a fixed term and, crucially, non-renewable. This is so important because it stops power from hardening into a personal possession. You're constantly forcing new blood and new perspectives into the system.
And because everyone knows they're leaving soon, no single person or group can become indispensable.
Exactly. It prevents the formation of an entrenched political class. The third principle is a shift in mindset. Service.
From ambition to duty.
Right. Under sortition, you hold authority as a civic duty, not as a prize for your personal ambition. The participants are there as temporary stewards for the community, and they know that very soon they're going to go back to their normal lives and have to live under the laws that they just created.
That's a powerful incentive for practicality, isn't it?
It's huge. It forces them to think about the real-world consequences for people like them, not about how a decision will play with donors or on cable news.
And the fourth principle, which is what the assembly actually does, is deliberation.
This is the core activity. And it has to be a very specific kind of deliberation. Structured, thoughtful, evidence-based discussion that aims for common understanding, not for victory.
That's the total opposite of a parliamentary debate.
It's the opposite of the win-lose combative posturing of electoral politics. Good deliberation needs time, it needs balanced information, and it needs skilled, neutral facilitation. It creates an environment where people can actually change their minds based on new evidence.
Which in electoral politics is called flip-flopping, and it's a death sentence.
Exactly. In an electoral system, changing your mind is weakness. In a deliberative sortition system, changing your mind based on the facts is a sign of maturity and responsibility. The entire goal is solving the problem, not winning the argument.
What's so compelling is that the case for sortition isn't just philosophical. The answer makes it clear that it's backed up by modern science on collective intelligence.
Right. This isn't just a nostalgic look back at Athens. It's about how groups actually make good decisions. The analysis draws a lot from the work of people like Scott Page on cognitive diversity.
And what's the key finding there?
The key finding is a bit counterintuitive. It's that under conditions of complexity, which perfectly describes modern public policy, a group with diverse ways of thinking will consistently outperform a group made up of the best individual experts.
So a room full of Nobel Prize-winning economists might make worse decisions about the economy than a more diverse group.
In a complex system, yes, because that room full of top economists might all share the same training, the same models, and therefore the same blind spots. They're prone to systematic shared errors.
So you bring in a nurse, a small business owner, a farmer, and the group actually gets smarter.
The group's collective intelligence increases because now you're integrating different kinds of knowledge. Economic theory, yes, but also knowledge about supply chains, about healthcare delivery, about how policies affect families. The other key mechanism is error reduction.
How does that work?
If a group is homogeneous, everyone tends to make the same kind of mistakes, which just reinforces the error. In a diverse group, people make different kinds of mistakes. Their errors are independent, and so they tend to cancel each other out.
Someone in the room is bound to see the flaw that everyone else missed because their life experience is different.
Precisely. Random selection is the ultimate guarantee of that cognitive diversity. It ensures someone in the room has the unique perspective needed to spot the unintended consequence or the flaw in the expert model. The group becomes self-correcting.
Okay, so let's connect this science directly back to the problems with elections we talked about in part one. How does sortition structurally eliminate those biases? Let's start with the money problem.
Well, as we established, elections require a massive financial architecture, which creates dependency on donors. All the reforms fail because they don't change the underlying need for money.
But sortition just turns off the tap.
It turns off the tap because it removes the need for it. If there are no campaigns, you don't need campaign funding, no fundraising emails, no gala dinners, no dialing for dollars. The entire donor class becomes irrelevant. It's the only structural solution that actually gets money out of politics.
Okay, what about the second bias? The personality trap. The fact that elections reward performers.
Elections are a stage. They reward charisma, slick marketing, and the ability to turn complex issues into simple, angry slogans. And that process filters out a huge number of really capable, thoughtful people.
The quiet collaborators, the detail-oriented thinkers, the introverts.
All of them. Sortition selects for citizens, not for performers. It values humility and the ability to listen over ego and spectacle. By removing the performance aspect, it allows the focus to shift entirely to the quality of the arguments and the data.
And the third one, the party machine. The way parties enforce conformity and manufacture conflict.
A sortition assembly is, by definition, an assembly of independence. The members are drawn randomly from the public. They have no party loyalty. They owe no political debts. They have no political career to protect.
That freedom must be incredible.
It's transformative. It means they are free to actually change their minds when they hear a better argument. They can follow the evidence wherever it leads without worrying about towing a party line. The entire structure is geared towards collaborative problem solving, not partisan warfare.
This change in incentives must completely alter the whole ethical atmosphere of governing. Let's talk about accountability. Sortition gives members freedom from the re-election trap.
This is such a profound advantage. An elected politician is always thinking about the next election, which is just 2 or 4 years away. That short-term horizon makes it almost impossible to make necessary but unpopular long-term decisions.
Things like tackling climate change or fixing entitlement programs that have a long-term payoff but short-term political pain.
Exactly. Those are politically suicidal in an electoral system. But because a sortition member's term is fixed and they can't be reselected, they are completely free to act in the long-term public interest without worrying about getting punished at the polls. Their independence is their integrity.
And because they are just ordinary citizens who will go back to their lives, their priorities are different.
Their decisions are rooted in public priorities and lived reality. The answer makes this point so well. A policy about public transportation isn't being debated by a wealthy politician who gets driven everywhere in a black car.
It's being debated by people who actually ride the bus to work every day.
Exactly. That direct, tangible connection to the consequences grounds every decision in practicality, not political theory, and that addresses the huge representation gap we have now.
Most of our politicians come from a very narrow slice of society. Wealthy, highly educated, often lawyers.
And when people see a governing body that actually looks and sounds and thinks like their own community, a true cross-section with retail workers and teachers and retirees, it fundamentally restores legitimacy.
It's easier to trust a decision made by a group of people that includes people like you.
Even if the decision is difficult. That visual and demographic reflection reduces the sense of alienation and cynicism. People start to see the government not as them over there, but as us right here.
A lot of this can sound very theoretical, but a key argument in the answer is that we have recent real-world proof that this works. And not on easy issues, but on the hardest, most politically toxic ones.
That's right. The prime example is the French Citizens' Climate Convention from 2019 to 2020.
So set the scene for us. What was this?
It was a massive experiment. They took 150 French citizens, randomly selected but stratified to be a perfect demographic mirror of France, age, gender, income, education, rural versus urban. And they gave them a huge task.
Which it was?
Come up with a set of policies to cut France's carbon emissions by 40% by 2030, with one critical condition. The proposals had to be socially just.
So they spent months on this, hearing from tons of experts. What did they come up with?
The results were breathtakingly ambitious, but also incredibly pragmatic and technically sound. They proposed 149 distinct measures. Things like banning short-haul domestic flights where a good train alternative exists, launching a massive program to retrofit homes for energy efficiency, creating a new tax on the most polluting vehicles.
And what about that social justice piece? That's where these policies usually fall apart in the political arena.
And that's where the Citizen Assembly absolutely shined. They built equity into every proposal. For example, they paired the new vehicle tax with subsidies and rebates to help low-income people afford cleaner cars. They proposed huge state subsidies to help poor families retrofit their homes.
So they found that balance between ambition and fairness, that elected politicians who are terrified of backlash and lobbyists can never seem to find.
They found it because they were free from that political fear. Their only job was to solve the problem.
And we've seen similar successes in Ireland's citizens' assemblies on really divisive moral issues.
Yes, Ireland used this model to tackle the incredibly difficult constitutional questions around abortion and same-sex marriage. These were issues that had paralyzed their elected politicians for decades in bitter, acrimonious deadlock.
But when you gave the issue to A group of ordinary citizens.
When you gave them time, balanced information, and a respectful, deliberative space, they handled the moral complexity with incredible care and nuance. Their recommendations paved the way for successful national referenda, and the public was far more willing to accept the outcomes because they didn't come from the usual partisan squabbling.
Okay, so if we're going to scale this up from a single-issue assembly to national governance, the design has to be incredibly robust. You can't just pull 500 names out of a hat.
No, absolutely not. And Kizzi Nkwocha is very clear that the randomness has to be carefully structured. The key is using stratified random sampling.
Which means you're not just doing a pure lottery, you're creating quotas.
You're creating quotas to guarantee a perfect demographic mirror of the nation. It's intentional inclusion. You stratify by age, gender, region, the urban-rural split, but also by things like education level and income bracket.
So you ensure that you don't accidentally end up with an assembly that's, say, 70% college-educated city dwellers.
Exactly. You guarantee that working class voices, rural voices, and marginalized communities have their proportional seat at the table. That intentional design is what builds the legitimacy of the whole system.
But for any of this to work, you need powerful support mechanisms.
Right.
Otherwise, only the rich or retired could afford to serve.
This is absolutely essential. The system has to make it financially and logistically possible for anyone to serve. That means, first, proper financial compensation that replaces any lost wages.
And things like childcare.
Guaranteed high-quality childcare, covering all travel and living expenses. You have to remove every single barrier that might prevent a single mother or a small business owner from being able to participate. If you don't, the system fails its own core principle of equality.
And what about how long they serve? And how you manage the transition?
That's the question of term lengths and rotation. Terms need to be long enough for people to learn the ropes, maybe 2 or 3 years, but the rotation has to be staggered. So, for example, you might rotate out 1/3 of the assembly every year.
And that staggered rotation solves the big continuity objection, the fear that you lose all your institutional memory every couple of years.
It solves it perfectly. You always have a majority of experienced members on hand to help the newcomers, and you have a professional, nonpartisan staff. This gives you the best of both worlds, a constant influx of fresh perspectives, without losing stability or accumulated knowledge.
I think the deepest fear people have about this idea is what's called the Sir Humphrey objection. The worry that a group of ordinary citizens, no matter how smart, will just be manipulated by the permanent, expert bureaucracy around them.
It's a very valid concern, and the answer proposes several powerful safeguards to prevent this kind of bureaucratic capture. The first is that the Citizens' Assembly must have total control over its own staff.
So they hire and fire their own researchers, their own facilitators.
Exactly. The staff's loyalty and accountability is to the Citizen Assembly, and only to the Assembly, not to a government department, not to a political party. This prevents a permanent administrative class from quietly filtering information or steering outcomes to serve their own agenda.
And the second safeguard deals with the information itself. It's called the adversarial presentation model.
Right. And this rejects the myth that information can ever be truly neutral. Instead of having staff present a single curated summary of an issue, you operate like a courtroom.
The citizens act as a jury.
Precisely. They hear the best possible case for one policy option, presented by its expert proponents, and then they hear the best possible case against it, presented by an opposing set of experts.
So they're forced to see the disagreements, the uncertainties, the trade-offs.
It exposes the full scope of the debate. It forces them to weigh competing evidence and judge arguments on their merits, rather than just passively accepting the authority of a single source. It's the ultimate defense against being manipulated by a single, biased point of view.
And what other checks and balances are built into this system?
Well, it's saturated with them. All proceedings and expert testimony must be transparent and public. The decisions are still subject to judicial review for constitutionality. And maybe the most powerful check is reversibility.
Meaning the next group of citizens can undo what the last group did.
Yes. A policy isn't set in stone forever. Future cohorts, also randomly selected, can revisit and revise past decisions. This allows the system to learn from its mistakes and adapt over time. It's a self-correcting mechanism.
And of course, the ultimate check is the diversity of the group itself.
That's the final backstop. A body that includes every part of society is structurally designed to be resistant to capture by any one special interest or narrow ideology. Its diversity is its greatest strength. When you boil it all down, the core message of The Answer by Kizzi Nkwocha is a really tough one. It says that if your political structure is built to reward conflict and personal ambition, it will always produce dysfunction, no matter how good the people in it are.
So trying to elect better people is a losing game.
It's a losing game. Sortition isn't about going back in time, it's an evolution. It's about finally aligning our political structure with what we now know from science about collective intelligence and how to handle complexity. It's about systematically removing the distorting forces of money, performance, and party loyalty.
And the book argues very powerfully that the cost of not changing, the cost of sticking with our broken habits, is this slow, steady erosion of public faith that we see all around us.
And that path leads directly towards the authoritarian temptation. We are already seeing nations walk down it. The current system is failing to deliver.
It's a profound shift in thinking.
It is. Because the sortition system makes a fundamentally different request of us. It asks the public to trust in its own collective wisdom, instead of outsourcing our trust to a tiny, self-selected, careerist political class.
So we'll leave you with this to think about. What would it actually feel like to live in a democracy where governing wasn't a permanent, cynical performance by a cast of ambitious characters? What if, instead, it felt like a shared, temporary civic responsibility that rotated through your own community, through your own neighbors? It asks us to imagine a future where citizenship truly means taking your turn to govern.